Yeah, g'day YouTubers. Tinker O'Toole again here with another review of the Tecomec Jolly Evo. We've had this grinder for about 1 year, so we're going to talk about all its good points, all its bad points, what I think about it, and sharpening in general. But before we get into sharpening chainsaw chain in general, what's also very important is the grinding wheel and how you dress it. So we'll just go over and have a look at that first, and then we'll come back to the sharpening. So over here, I've got a diagram, and we'll just see if we can zoom in a little bit. This is the wheel, and the most important part is this radius that's here, this curve. And when you dress a wheel, really there's not much point dressing this side, because this side really doesn't touch anything. It's this side that does here. And if you don't get your curve right, then it really doesn't grind a nice profile. And when you've got your grinding stone like this, you really only need to be dressing, worrying about between, you see people have the stone and the wheel's spinning around and they're going from side to side, from side to side. Well, you don't need to be grinding the bottom, and you don't need to be grinding this side much at all. You really need to focus just on the straight edge. A lot of people are grinding up here on the edge of the wheel. You don't really want to be grinding up here on the edge. That's the part where the grinding wheel touches the tooth here. This is the most critical part, the first millimetre or so. The rest really doesn't matter. So what I've got here, you can imagine if the wheel was at 90 degrees. You would start here and just move a little bit like that until you get that nice curve. And you can just touch the other side up as well, just the corner. Just to have a nice little bit of a curve on it. You don't have to have a huge radius or do anything, because it will never touch anything. It won't grind anything. And certainly don't be grinding too much on the bottom. It's sort of from this part, that's all you really need to worry about, and just touch this side. Try and avoid the bottom, because when you think about it, this is what your curve's going to look like. This is going to rest on the bottom of the gullet. So you're not going to get any huge advantage of grinding this at all, because it really doesn't do much. And even if you look at the Stihl USG grinder, they don't even really worry about the other side as well. You can spend all your time dressing up the other side, but it really doesn't do much. I'd just dress it up a little bit like this, just to give it a little bit of a curve. But concentrate on this corner, and as I say, avoid grinding the side edges too much. Because if you start to grind the side edges up here, there's people up there that are grinding and bringing this down like a big, huge sweep. Totally the wrong angle. Now, on most of these type of grinders, you will be getting a card that comes like that. As I say, focus on this side, the left side, or the left side more, because it's the left side that goes into the grinding tooth. So the tooth is here on the Oregon type grinder. It's this side. And that's why it's critical to get that beautiful curve. So what we'll do next is go back to the grinder, and we can dress the wheel a little bit. The wheel is in pretty good nick, so I'm going to barely touch the wheel. So we'll just go over that grinding procedure one more time. And as I say, that's pretty critical. The actual settings aren't as critical. There's only a few sort of... the profile that you're looking for, this angle that comes down into the tooth, is between 50 and 60 degrees, but typically 60 degrees is the most common. The top plate cutting angle, that's the angle that's on top of the tooth here. Most of the time, 30 degrees is probably the most popular, or 25, one or the other. They're the really two angles that you've got to worry about. And the other one that's critical is also how deep you bring the wheel into the tooth. You don't want to be grinding the bottom into the gullet. And this side edge of the wheel is just meant to just come down about 1 millimeter or so. And it gives you a nice, beautiful 60-degree angle. So how you dress the wheel can make a big difference on how it cuts. And setting the angles, although there's not a huge variation in the angles because the angles are generic for cutting a cross grain timber for firewood or felling. So typically you've got 60 degrees on the top plate cutting angle. That's the angle that comes in. The curve of the file, if the file's held in the right spot, if you're freehand filing, the curve of the file will give you about a 60-degree angle, provided you're holding the file exactly in the right spot. So it's critical that you understand that to get the best optimal angle, and we'll go over that. Okay, so the next thing I want to sort of get out of the way is that periodically maintenance, that this has a slide-in vise, and you need to make sure that the grinding wheel is centered. So in the grinding position, when you're grinding teeth, that is a position of the height that we need to make sure that is adjusted. So when I pull this wheel down, that was the grinding position that presumably that you ground your tooth in the last position. So that's what you need to do. Make sure that this is in the grinding position. Set the vise on 0. Now, when we sort of zoom in there a little bit, you'll notice that the center of the spindle on the motor is to the right-hand side. And due to the pivot point, so there's a pivot point there, and you look at the distance, as we move the handle down, this is going to move in an arc, and that arc is going to come in and out of line of the ruler. So when it's down in the grinding position, we want that exactly where that is now, right in the middle of the ruler. And if we zoom in, you'll be able to see that's exactly where it is, close enough. Let's just say that the grinding wheel's worn down a little bit and you need to adjust it. Now, what's going to happen in that situation? You will find out that you need to move it that way, the vise. So you will loosen this, and you might find out that you're only 1 degree out. So if we sort of come down and have a look at the vise, you can see that we're close enough on 0, and if we were out, you may move it even 0.5 degree. You just need to move it slightly off the 0 mark until that ruler lines up. That's something that you need to do every now and then. It's not something that you need to do all the time. Typically, I would check that. Look, you could measure the wheel, and if every time that the wheel gets down by a diameter of 5 millimeters, I'd be doing an alignment. It just means that if you do an alignment, that the left and the right teeth are being ground exactly at the right angle. It doesn't go off center to one side. And that's what you're trying to do, making sure that your grinding is equal between the left and the right. So the next thing we'll talk about is the angles, which are fairly critical. We spoke about the grinding the stone, so maybe we should just talk about that briefly again. Now, this is the side. This is the inside of the wheel. Now, what we'll do is just turn it. I need to plug this in. So I don't have a lead at the moment. Hang on, yes we do. We've got power over here. And we'll just do a brief dressing of the stone. Okay, so we only need to dress the inside of this stone. And now what you need to avoid is people sometimes hold it on this angle and do this big huge sweeping motion. You only roughly want it on a 45 degree angle and just move it a little bit like that. You don't really need to do this side because that side doesn't touch. If you feel free that you want to, you can just barely touch it like that. But the most important part is this part here. So you really don't have to don't hold it like that because you don't want to reduce the diameter of the wheel. So avoid grinding the bottom. If you do grind the bottom, look, hold it at 45 and you can just sort of like stop or barely touch the bottom. Barely touch it. And avoid holding it vertical. Hold it about at this angle. But it's mainly this 45-degree angle that will give you that nice radius. So avoid the bottom and avoid the side. Mainly concentrate at this angle here. And that's it. That's all you need to do. And you can check it with your plastic card if need be to make sure that it's spot on. So the next thing is the head angle, the grinding head. What angle do you set that to? Well, that's referred to as a top plate cutting angle. That's a correct technical term. So the top plate cutting angle has an angle, settings on the back of this grinder, and the default for 99% of chains out there that you're going to be dealing with for your general cutting purposes will be 60 degrees. We'll just zoom in on that one. So we start off at 90 degrees down here. Quite a large increments. The spacing is quite generous. A little bit difficult to see, but we end up at 40 degrees. Over the top there, you can just see the 40 degrees there. So quite a large scale. I have heard people say that this scale was inaccurate. Well, I checked this with my digital angle gauge and I found it to be spot on. Same as I use the digital angle gauge on this. I set this grinder up so this was sitting up vertical. That's why I got the black line on there. And I checked it with a digital angle gauge and it was spot on. So I haven't found no errors in this. And these would all come out of the same mould. So I would suspect that all these grinders, the Jolly Evo, would be spot on. Okay. Now this angle at the back, getting back to the top plate angle. That's the angle that when we've got the tooth, the grinding wheel is going to come in here, and this part is probably the most critical, the tip. This working corner where I've got, this part's the most important to be sharp. The top plate, the beveled edge, so that's the beveled, that's what we call a compounded beveled angle. You've got two angles, that's your top plate angle there, and that angle that's on a slope is referred to the top plate cutting angle. So this is the most critical part, especially here. Down here is nowhere near as critical. This does all the work. And on a semi-chisel as well, not just a full chisel. But a full chisel will become blunter, quicker than a semi-chisel. So the angles that some people like to play around with is generally 50 degrees is more aggressive. So generally between 50 and 60, but 60 would be the most common worldwide. So if you sit it on 60, you can't go wrong. Now, this is the top plate angle. So again, we're referring to the angle on here. The most common angle for semi-chisel is 30 degrees. 30 degrees to the left, 30 degrees to the right. We'll just zoom in there so that you can see that. There's your 30 degrees there. And there's your other 30 degrees. 30 degrees is a little bit aggressive. And on full chisel, still recommend 30 degrees, but a lot of other companies recommend 25. So typically you'll be going between 25 and 30. These other angles below that you will not use. If you're doing milling chain or skip chain, you may use 10 degrees or 15. That's a different story, milling and skip chains. What we're talking about here is general cutting. across the grain, firewood, etc., dropping trees down. You may hear the terminology, you say, oh, I've got a profile 60, 30, 10. The 10 means that you can actually have a 10 degrees downward tilt on your chain. It's what we refer to thinning out the edge, the working corner. And when people use a file, what they tend to do, if it requires 10 degrees downward tilt, normally your file is held horizontal on your tooth, and 10 degrees would be something like that. And what it does, when you drop the file down, it starts to file more of the corner. It reduces this C shape here, thins the corner out a little bit, and I'm not talking about a lot, only a little bit. And it generally is less aggressive, and it's a little bit more durable. When you've got this sharp point on a full chisel, it doesn't take much to get it blunt, because a semi-chisel, and we've got a tooth here, the semi-chisel has a much larger radius on the point, as you can see. So because of that large radius on the point, it takes a lot longer to wear it down and come, or not wear it down. It takes a lot longer for it to become blunt. Yes, it does wear a little bit through usage, but yeah, it will become blunt. It's more durable, but its cutting efficiency is less by about 10%. So full chisel is more aggressive. Okay, so we understand that if we're using a semi-chisel, we'll use 30 degrees. If we're using full chisel, we'll use 25. You can use 30 all the time if you want. It just depends on... Let's put it another way. If you're cutting soft timber, I just go for 30 degrees on everything on here. If you've got some really hard wood, 25 degrees will be a little bit more durable, a little bit slower in the cutting, but not much. But yeah, that's the difference where you can change between 25 and 30 between hard and softwood. And even on the top plate cutting angle, if you've got softwood, some people will go even as much as 50 degrees. So that's your variation between soft and hardwood. If you know, up to 5 degrees on here, and up to 10 degrees on here between hardwood and softwood. That's your variable. Your next control is this side, this backstop moves from side to side. If you're doing a left-handed tooth, which is the one closest to the grinder, it's best to wind this knob and push this over to the left-hand side. That way it gives more clearance from the grinding wheel. And on the right-hand side, you do the same thing. You bring it to this side here so that it's got more clearance from the grinding wheel, because they're very easy to grind off the corner if you don't do that. Doesn't have a lock nut, but it's a plastic knob, and it's quite tight on the shaft so it doesn't come loose. Here we've got a lock nut, and we increase this to go forwards towards the grinding wheel. So that's the adjustment when you loosen that to adjust the top plate cutting angle, and this adjustment here is for the depth. Now this is also another important part, that you don't bring this grinding wheel down really deep. And I'll just grab this tooth and I'll put a mark on it. You really don't want to be bringing the grinding wheel down much deeper than that. So, yeah, you've got to get that right, that balance, because you don't want to be grinding the gullet. There's no advantage to grinding it. The gullet is this bottom part here, and we try and keep that fairly flat so that it actually helps the chips evacuate a little bit easier. A little bit of a controversy on that about, you know, how good it works. Get the gullet. You may have come across that phrase. So the other adjustment is the vise. Now we'll just move this out of the way. We spoke about doing an alignment on the vise, but the vise is also used for 10 degrees tilt. So we'll look at the vise again. So there we are there. You can see that it says 15 degrees. Now this is the positive, even though it doesn't have a positive side on it. But we refer to this side as a positive. We refer to this side closest to the back of the grinder as the negative. Now, if the chain calls for a 10 degrees downward tilt, the way that that works, and you'll probably come across this, is, and it's the guide rails there, the tooth, if we do 10 degrees downward tilt, the tooth vise, so if we're going to do the tooth that's on the left-hand side, the vise will be moved towards the back. There's 10 degrees there. We'll just have a look. Just get down here. You can see I've moved the vise 10 degrees. There's the little mark there, 10 degrees. So that is for the left-hand tooth, viewed from the back. So if we view it from the back, what we just did then was move the vise that way towards the back. If we're going to do a 10 degrees tilt for the right-hand tooth, we move it 10 degrees, and I'll just do it there. We move it 10, that's back to 0. 10 degrees is that way. So just remember, that's the left tooth, that's the right tooth. If it requires tilt, you move them away from the center, away from the middle. So the left tooth is 10 degrees that way, the right tooth is 10 degrees that way. And as I said, what it does, it thins out the edge, it reduces if you've got too much hook. If the grinding wheel goes too deep, you can get too much hook. That's the same thing as having the file too deep into the tooth as well. You can get too much hook. Now, that's probably about it. The only other thing that I could probably touch on is when a lot of people use grinders, the biggest mistake that everybody makes, two things. Grinding dirty chains. If you grind dirty chains, the actual stone's going to get impregnated with oil and grease and all sorts of crap. That will accelerate heating up the tooth, which is what you want to avoid. A lot of people use grinders and all the teeth look blue, so it changes the temper. You really have to avoid that. To avoid that, when you pull this handle down, you've got to use a tapping motion, off, on, off, on. Now we need to set the grinder up. So we've already set the head at 60 degrees, which is the standard. And I've got a little bit of a chain here. So we'll just set this chain up. Pop it on the grinder. Just come around here. We'll do a right hand tooth so that you can see it. I'll just wind the backstop a little bit to the back of the grinder. I'll bring this back round to 30 degrees because we're doing the right hand side. So I've wound that the wrong way. I need to bring this out. Okay, so that's got good clearance. Now, bring the wheel down and you'll see that there's quite a large gap. And what I want to do is just adjust that. See if we can zoom in there. And it's just a matter now of adjusting that so that it just touches the side of the wheel. So with this finger, now it's sitting on the bottom of the chain. So I want to just bring this out a little bit. Just fiddling around so that it just touches the chain. You can see that. I just want to lock that in a position. Make sure that that's everything's all tight. Now you can see the wheel rotating. So what I need to check now needs to go down a little bit. So I need to adjust this adjustment here. Turn it in slowly. It's just touching the wheel at the moment. Now I'll just back that off a little bit. You just got to spend a bit of time fiddling around because you want to get it right. Okay, so you can see that the wheel's spinning freely. So now what we need to do is adjust this backstop here. Turn this knob clockwise and continue turning it till it just touches the wheel. There it goes. Now you'll notice the backstop is very, very close to the wheel, so we need to just bring that backstop over out of the way. Going to lock that in a position. That's just touching now. I think that the grinding head can still go down a little bit, so I'll just turn that in a little bit. That's pretty good. That's barely touching. Now, in that situation, that's good enough to start the grinder. But people make the mistake of going in too aggressive. So we'll turn that on. And we'll just bring that down nice and slow. Now that needs a little bit more. And we'll just adjust that backstop. And I can tell it needs to go down a little bit, so we'll just screw that screw in. Still needs a bit more. Nice and slow. Need to bring that down a little bit more. That's about it. Not much left of that tooth. A little bit hard to focus. There we go. Look at that. Beautiful. Nice little C shape still. Pretty much getting towards the end of the life. Now because that's set up, it would be a matter now of doing the next tooth. Now, I know what you're going to say, there's not much left of this chain, but this chain here now is, I don't use it, it's just keep it for demonstration purposes or whatever. So now it's just a matter of doing all this chain, and when you're finished, you need to do the same thing the other side, making sure that you're not grinding too deep into the gullet. When you're finished, take the chain off, inspect it. If you need to do a couple of other teeth, then you can. But the main thing is that you bring this grinding wheel down nice and slow, off, on, off, on. And don't take too much at a time. Remember to adjust this so that the tooth barely touches the wheel. Have this so that it's sitting in the right place, it's not below the chrome. Just take your time setting it up, and you'll find out that you'll end up doing a good job. A good job will be done if you take your time. If you rush in at it and you adjust the backstop too far into the wheel and also too far deep down into the gullet, you're going to overload the grinder. It's liable to blue the teeth and you're going to end up with a real terrible grind. A lot of people blame grinders for a lot of things, but in a lot of the cases, it's not the grinder, it's the person using the grinder. So hopefully those little tips help. And next time you're using your grinder, just remember, take your time. In this situation, it usually wins the race, taking your time. Rush in it at a bullet a gate, anything can happen. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.